Prologue. Bathsheba watched motes of dust dancing in the shaft of sunlight and let forth a heavy sigh. It earned her a stern glare from Shan, but that didn't make the sentiment behind it any less heartfelt. After 15 days of solid rain pounding the earth around the farm into a fury of mud, the sun had emerged from behind the heavy layers of cloud, and Bathsheba had found herself confined to the hay barn, along with all the other children. It confirmed that this always happened, though Bathsheba had a long enough memory to recall being grateful at the sight of the raven-haired teacher strolling towards the farm at harvest time. Then Shan's lessons had brought Bathsheba a longed-for respite from her fumbling attempts, doomed to failure, at using the scythe. The scythe had been her father's idea. It needed 2 arms to wield the instrument properly, 2 good arms. To the shaft he had attached a leather thong which could be tightened around her right wrist, and with her left arm she was just about able to swing it. But her efforts were useless. The blade either swung too low because she couldn't support it, or it merely flattened the stalks. The exercise was intended to strengthen her right arm, which had been withered at birth, but gradually it became apparent that it did no such thing, and so she was given a break from that work. Father had then given her the job of going round the field, after the grain had been flailed from the stalks and the hay stacked, to pick up all of the stray grains which had fallen. This job, too, was tiresome and, though it provided Bathsheba with time to free her imagination, before a very great time she began to hate tramping up and down fields. Her attention turned back towards Shan. What had she been talking about? The last thing she could remember was something about Dinorban, the fortress where the council, the Tuatha de Danann, held their meetings. Bathsheba had never been there, although at most it must be only 2 days' ride away. She had seen pictures of the circle, which was guarded night and day by General Nuada and his soldiers, and she had heard stories, whispered late at night, about exactly why General Nuada and his soldiers guarded the circle so closely. And though she had never really left the farm, her mind had ranged far and wide throughout the kingdom of Tir Na Nog, to the Shay on the far western shores, to the ferocious waves which beat eternally against the hospitable islands in the distant north, to the Fommois who inhabited the dark mountains to the south, just visible if you stood on top of the chimney, a risky business for someone who could only cling on with one hand, and who couldn't run very fast if father caught her up there. Shan was talking about Gurivni now, and judging by the expectant look on her face, she had just asked a question. Bathsheba looked around wildly, hoping that she wouldn't be called upon to answer it. To her surprise, Gabby, the eldest, pushed himself to his feet and began to mumble in his usual manner. "Speak up, Gabriel," Shan told him, "so that we can all hear you. It's no good talking to the ground." Gabby blushed furiously and lifted his head up to stare fervently at a hayfork hanging on the wall behind Shan. Now his words tumbled over each other in their eagerness to get out of the constriction of his throat, but at least Bathsheba could hear him. She never tired of hearing Gabby talk about Gurivni, for Gurivni was a god, and one day she hoped to meet him. "Please, Shan, I saw Gurivni when I was very young. He were tall, taller than father, even taller than the man who came to tell us that Hugh was dead, and he had on a hat so you couldn't see his face, and he come on a big flying rock. He poked something into our sheep, because father said he didn't want them to get no sick no more. That was before any of this lot was born, so I's the only one that's seen him." When he had finished, Shan gave him a warm smile and told him to sit down again. Then she turned to look for something in her bag. As she bent down, her long black hair tumbled about her shoulders, and this set Bathsheba off thinking again. Bathsheba had always looked with envy upon Shan's hair, not because it glistened in the sunlight, or because it always smelled so nice, not because it was black whilst Bathsheba's was a thin mousy colour. No, the reason for her envy was that Shan had such long flowing lengths. Bathsheba's hair was cut close to the skin, and always had been. Nobody had cared to tell her why this was so, but eventually she had been given an answer of sorts by one of the other girls. "It's in case you're a witch," she had been told. A witch? They thought she might be a witch, but how could they? She had never done anything bad, or had she? She had spent long hours thinking about it, but it was only when she had seen father throw the small foal with skin over its eyes and misshapen legs onto the constantly burning fire at the back of the farm that the reason had come to her. It was all because of her withered arm. As far as her parents were concerned, it was a deformity, and for all they knew, she could have been born deformed because she had witch's blood in her. Bathsheba shivered at the thought of the other burning which she had encountered, and which had left an even deeper impression on her. On the far side of the farm there was a wood, which, out of curiosity, Bathsheba had one day wandered into. As she ventured into the cool green silence, a pungent smell assailed her nostrils. She walked further and further, and the trees drew closer around her, until she had found herself having to force her way through sharp brambles and sweet-smelling bracken. Eventually, she had stumbled out into a clearing. The ground, littered with skeletal leaves and fragile branches, was scorched and blackened. Smoke rose where the debris still smouldered. Little wonder, for a strong fire had burnt here. In the centre of the clearing there was a thick stone post, engraved deeply with signs and wardings against the power of Aron. The markings were encrusted with charred remains, and a light powdering of ash clung to the surface of the post. Bathsheba moved around the very edge of the clearing until she could see the other side of the post. She grimaced in horror at the sight, but a morbid fascination prevented her from looking away. A blackened corpse hung there, suspended by chains clamped tightly around its wrists. What skin there was left was shriveled, shrunken, but for the most part it had burnt away, leaving crisp muscles and brittle bones exposed to the air. But the horror did not end there, for just as Bathsheba had felt the bile rising to her mouth, the head lifted upwards, white eyes agape, and the mouth fell open as if to scream. But rather than sound, it was a torrent of oily black smoke that poured out. Sitting in the hay barn, Bathsheba's mouth felt dry as she remembered running as fast as she could, away from the apparition, and finally, when she could run no more, falling to the ground and fainting in a pool of her own sick. She had woken on her bed in the farmhouse, with concerned faces looking down at her, but afterwards no one mentioned the incident. She had begun to wonder if it had all been a bad dream, but had ventured into the wood again and had found the stone post. No horror hung there, but the circle of sickly-looking grass which surrounded it was more than enough to convince her of the truth of what she had seen. And she knew that the stone post was the fate which awaited her if there was any indication that she too might be a witch. That was the reason why her hair was regularly shorn by her loving mother, so that at the first sign of a darkening of the skin, midway between the nape of her neck and the lobe of her ear, she could be burnt without hesitation before she could cause any harm. Her family were watching for the mark of the witch. She gave another wistful look at the small patch of blue sky just visible through the circular window above the barn door, and then tried to concentrate on the lesson. She slipped easily into daydreaming again, and before she knew it, the lesson was over and she was following the others out of the barn. By the time she had emerged from its shadow, the yard was empty, and she stumbled across the cobbles towards the delightful smell of freshly baked bread. She could hear her brothers' and sisters' cries of pleasure as they snatched up the hot bread from their plates and juggled it from hand to hand until it cooled enough for it to be eaten. She pushed open the door and was greeted by a breath of warm air. Then she entered the dimly lit humidity of the kitchen. The family sat around the table waiting for her. There were 2 empty places at the table, one for her, and the other set with an ample helping just in case Dagda, or maybe Sylvanus, should arrive at the doorstep. Bathsheba settled down onto her stool and waited whilst Mother burnt the first loaf from the oven before she and all the others began eating their own meals. A chunk of bread, a wedge of cheese, A ripe purple beetroot and, as a treat, a piece of salted fish made up the meal, and it was consumed all too quickly. Bathsheba pushed her plate down along the table and then rose and went out into the yard. One of the cows was gazing soulfully at her over the wall, and so she went and rubbed its face. The other children kicked a broken tin cup around the yard and laughed at her when it landed at her feet and she tried to kick it back. She turned away from them and saw Druford the troll watching her from the shadows of the cowshed. She waved at him and grinned as he tried to manoeuvre his heavy features into a smile. Then Sian was standing in the door to the barn, calling for them to come and settle down again. Bathsheba leant against the wall where the sun had just been falling and felt its warmth seep into her back. Sian's voice droned on, and then she felt the wind rushing over her skin as she pounded across the grassy plain. Her large lungs drew in the air, sweeping it over the sensitive mucous membranes of her nostrils, which responded by sending messages to her brain and painting a picture of smells so vivid that she could almost see it superimposed on her vision. Her feet drummed a rhythm out upon the ground. Her left foot hit, then her right foot. She lifted her left foot, and then another left foot went down. Another left foot! Yes, for she now realized that she had 4 feet. Her right foot rose, and then her 2 hind feet were on the ground together. Up came her left hind. Then momentarily she was flying. Then the tattoo against the soil was repeated, and again and again. She let out a whinny of joy at the strength that she felt, and flicked her ears back and forth. A low ditch appeared in the distance, approached rapidly, and she leapt. The moment lasted forever, and then she was on the ground again. Now shapes impinged on the edge of her sight, and she realized that she wasn't galloping alone. To either side of her were grey shapes whose legs moved in perfect harmony with hers, and in front and to the left she saw a marvellous stallion and a heart filled with love. It was a large creature with sleek black lines. Sunlight glistened in an iridescent sheen on hair, which rippled as it followed the contractions and relaxations of wonderfully strong muscles. His tail streaked out behind him, swirling in his slipstream. His appearance was heightened by a hazy aura of smell, which excited her unaccountably. She wanted to impress this one, and so she tried to put on an extra turn of speed. Pushing her warm muscles to overcome their limits, she inched closer to him and veered to her left so that she was closer behind him. His smell grew stronger, inciting her to greater efforts. But she couldn't overtake him, and so she resumed her original position and merely let the feeling of her vitality course through her, and then she was back in the hay barn, trying to catch the thread of what Sian had been saying. A trickle of a tear twisted sinuously down her dusty cheek at the thought of the power she had just felt. Her body, with its weak muscles, was nothing compared to that. Luckily for us, Gwivney was able to trap all the demons he had made under his island, and so all the evil that they had within them has stayed there. Sian gave a stern look to the children and paused, an indication to the children that they were about to be told the moral for the day. Even if they hadn't paid any attention during those hours, they should at least remember this message. But that doesn't mean that we can become complacent. For once in a while a demon may escape, and come among us and cause all sorts of mischief. The way to recognize such a creature is by a mark on the back of the neck, and the remedy is burning. Bathsheba hadn't heard half of this, because she had been wondering what complacent was. But she heard the last word, and she rubbed the soft downy hair on the back of her head, and shivered. "All right, children," Sian said, "that's enough lessons for today. You can go out and play in what's left of the afternoon." With one accord, the children were up and through the barn door, all except for Bathsheba, who followed them slowly. She wandered out of the farm and climbed laboriously up the hill which overlooked it. The farmhouse itself was the tallest building, by virtue of the chimney which rose high so that its smoke was carried far away from the hay barn, which squatted at its side. Opposite the house was the L-shaped cowshed, behind which was the large, low grain store. The buildings were surrounded by small fields, their boundaries marked by well-built rough stone walls. Leading away from the farmhouse was a narrow lane which vanished into nothing once it got beyond the central core of fields. She settled down on a comfortable hummock of grass, lay on her back and gazed up into the sky, her eyes half shut. Above her head was the blinding glare of the sun, but just visible, in the direction of her feet, was the pale red globe of the other sun, which was at its most obvious at night time. Father had told her that the day sun was drawn behind Dagda's war chariot, and the night sun, which when it was in the night sky lent a red twilight cast to the landscape, was drawn behind Aron's chariot. She rolled over and pressed her face into the cool grass. First, she tried to block out all the sunlight by wrapping her arms around her head. When she had done that, she looked closely at the grass, trying to see if there were any insects crawling there. After some time, a beetle made its way between the forest of blades, and she caught it on her good hand. She held it up in the sunlight and watched it scurry along her arm. Then she dropped it back onto the soil. She looked down at the farm and saw that Paul was waving to her to come for supper. She pushed herself to her feet and began to make her way back down the hill. In the kitchen, an extra place had been laid for Sian, who was given the privilege of holding the spoon of broth over the fire until it sizzled away. After the meal, the table was pushed to one side and the family gathered around the fireplace. "How have the children been, my dear?" Father asked Sian. "Oh, they have been as children always are when I come to teach them things. A lot of daydreaming, wandering minds, and bored faces." Father laughed. "I was probably the same with your grandmother." "Yes, you were," Mother told him. There was a long silence, finally broken by Sian. "I see you have some books. May I look at them?" "I'll get them," shouted Pris, and ran over to the shelf. She jumped up and down, trying to reach them, until Gabby went and laughingly lifted her so that she could gather them up into her arms. She carried them over and dropped them into Sian's lap. She picked them up one by one and flicked through them. Then she looked up disappointed. "It's all strange words," she said. "No pictures." "I could read something from them if you like," suggested Father. "Would you?" Sian asked gratefully. Aquila shouted out, "Let Bathsheba! Let Bathsheba!" Sian raised an eyebrow at this. "Bathsheba can read this?" "My grandfather taught me how to read it," Father told her, "and I taught Bathsheba. It's been passed down ever since we came to Tir na Nog." He picked up one of the books and opened it. "This is the most interesting one. It contains stories about the other world." He leafed through it as though he was looking for something. Then he handed the book to Bathsheba. "Here you are. Read this." Bathsheba looked at the story that Father had chosen for her to read, and her face fell slightly, for it was about a man who had been possessed by demons. She began to read, stumblingly at first, but then with increasing confidence. It quickly dealt with how the main character drove the demons out, but then went on to a long, wordy bit. The Council of Elders said, "It is only by Beelzebub," he's a demon, "that this fellow drives out demons. But he knew their thoughts and said back to them, 'Every kingdom divided against itself will be ruined, and every city divided against itself will not stand.'" Bathsheba carried on reading the tale, which on the whole was a rather dull affair, while Sian listened intently. When it was finished, Sian was silent for a short time. "Is it a book of wisdom in the other world?" she finally asked. "I usually just read the exciting bits in the first half," Bathsheba told her. Actually, she liked it most because it was a book about the other place, and she liked to imagine what it was like. "I don't know, really," said Father. "My grandfather told me that his grandmother considered it a very important book. There's a lot of stuff about their god, so maybe it's a religious book?" Suddenly, this discussion was interrupted by Pris shouting, "Daddy, can I show Sian my whistle?" And then all the children were asking to show Sian something they had made or could do. After a short time, Father glanced out of the window and saw that it was dark outside. "Right, everyone," he said. "It's time to get to bed. Sian, I've made you a place to sleep by the children's bedroom, if that's all right. "Oh, yes, that'll be fine, thank you." All of the family made their way to their beds. Bathsheba heard her father going round and wishing all the other children a good night's sleep. As usual, he did not come to her. He never had since David had died. Before then, he had loved her very much, and had taken the time to teach her to do things with her mind to make up for her own weakness. But when David was killed, he had behaved as though it had been her fault, and he had never been so close to her again. Before long, the house was filled with the silence characteristic of sleeping people. Bathsheba pulled her rough woolen blanket up over her head and drifted into a dream-filled sleep. She was walking along the lane that led up to the farm, between two rough stone walls that towered above her. David held her hand tightly so that she wouldn't stumble, and as he walked he told her jokes and made her laugh. Suddenly his expression changed and he turned round. Helpless in his grip, she was swept around with him, and bearing down on them, she saw the herd of cows. She remembered that they were being chased by a wild wolf. David began to drag her down the lane, but soon realised that he could not outrun them, and so he turned to the wall, picked her up, and threw her over it. As she sailed slowly through the air, she looked back and saw David starting to climb over the wall. One of the cows barreled into him, and he was knocked to the ground. She could hear his cries as the cow's feet struck down at him, and then all she could hear was the thunder of hooves in the lane, and then she woke and heard hoofbeats outside the farm. She crept out from her bed, and, treading carefully so as not to disturb the others, she went to the kitchen door and looked out into the yard. She gave a gasp of joy at the 3 keffils standing there. One was a stallion, its body a pool of darkness. It stood tall and proud above the 2 silver-grey mares. A hand fell upon her shoulder. "What are you doing out here, Bathsheba?" Father asked her. "It's Rush and her stallion," she told him. "Can I talk to her?" "All right, and I'll see what the stallion wants." She walked out into the yard, and the smaller of the 2 mares walked slowly towards her. The mare dipped its head down to Bathsheba, so that she could run her fingers along the narrow shaft of horn that protruded from the hair of its forelock. Immediately, a voice sounded inside her head. "Hello, Bats. I trust you are well." "Hello, Rush. I haven't seen you for a long time," Bathsheba answered. She was dimly aware of Father leading the other mare into the barn. "Why have you come here? Do I have to have a reason to come to see you?" "No, but I thought you wonder why my stallion brought Swift to your father?" Bathsheba nodded. "Swift is overdue. She needs some help bringing her foal into the world before it grows too big for her." Rush snickered softly and threw her head back a couple of times. "I accompanied them so that I could see you, and because I am running with my stallion." Rush dropped her head closer to Bathsheba's, in a movement that, in a human, would have indicated confidentiality. "I have not told him yet, but I missed my last cycle." Suddenly, Bathsheba heard another voice impinging on Rush's words. She looked round to find its source, but the voice was quiet and unclear. "What's that?" she asked. "My foal," Rush answered. "Her thoughts are muddled, but she is letting me know that she is all right. I shall name her Bat, after you." Bathsheba smiled at this compliment and hugged Rush's nose. "Would you like a run on my back?" Rush asked. Bathsheba eagerly nodded her head and moved round to Rush's side. She reached up to the mane hanging down to the left of the mare's neck and twisted a handful of it around her wrist. Rush strained round her head and boosted Bathsheba up onto her back. She weakly took a few pieces of hair from the withers in her right hand and gripped Rush's flanks with her knees as best she could. She needn't have worried, for when Rush started to move, it was with an easy gait, and besides, she knew that Rush would not allow her to fall. As she got used to the motion, she began to enjoy the feel of the cool night air plucking at her night garments and rushing swiftly across her face. It rapidly removed the last vestiges of sleep from her eyes, and she looked around her alertly. Watching the landscape speeding by, she started to notice, not with her eyes, but more with an intuitive sense, that it was going past faster than the horse itself was galloping. She leaned close into the curve of Rush's neck and asked, "Why is the ground moving faster than we are?" "It's all a question of time, my little bats," Rush replied. "You humans are so intent on your one little moment of present time. Well, we are, in a way, smudged in time. I don't understand. It's very hard to explain to someone who doesn't experience it. Now, hold on. We're going up this hill." Bathsheba clung tightly as Rush surged up the hill, and so she was safe when the mare abruptly halted. "Look over there. What do you see?" Rush raised her foreleg and indicated with that and a toss of her head that Bathsheba should look to the west, where the dim red orb was rising into the night sky. Bathsheba chewed the end of her finger and gazed intently to the west. "Nothing really. Farms, I suppose. The Shea settlements are to the west, but it's far too dark to see anything." Rush whinnied impatiently and stamped her hoof on the ground. "So what can you actually see?" Realization dawned on Bathsheba. "You mean Aaron's wheel!" she exclaimed. "Exactly!" Rush's voice echoed resoundingly in Bathsheba's head, and a loud background noise bubbled up to the surface of her mind. Bathsheba waited, while Rush quietened down the foal still within her womb. "So, what about it?" she asked eventually. "I told you we were not as you humans, how we are not entirely fixed to the present." She paused. "Yes?" prompted Bathsheba. "The red sun, Aaron's wheel as you call it, features very heavily in our futures, in all our futures. There are bad times coming to Tir Na Nog." "Bad times?" Bathsheba asked worriedly. "The worst," Rush affirmed ominously. Bathsheba was silent. She didn't know what she could say to this revelation of what was coming. Suddenly, Rush gave a high-pitched whinny. "Hold tight!" she shouted, and set off at a gallop down the hillside. "Time to return. It's all over at the farm, and my stallion will be waiting." They sped across the darkened countryside, and at last arrived back. Waiting in the yard were Father, the stallion, the mare, and a small, perfectly formed foal which wobbled unsteadily on its spindly legs. Its hair and skin were pure white, but for the witch mark that all of the intelligent creatures of Tir Na Nog, except the humans, bore. In the centre of its forehead was a small button that would eventually become its horn. Father lifted Bathsheba down off Rush's back, and they stood and watched the four Keffil trot unhurriedly down the lane. Just when they had almost vanished into the blackness, Bathsheba heard a faint voice in her head. "Goodbye, bats, and remember what I told you." Already, Bathsheba felt sleep returning to her, and she let Father guide her back to bed. Just this once he gave her a light kiss on the forehead, and then was gone. As she fell into the grip of sleep, she heard Rush's words returning to her. "There are bad times coming to Tir Na Nog, the worst. Remember, bats, remember." Central Park, New York, a place of escape for workers of the city, a haven for the overstressed and overpaid, a patch of greenery amidst the urban jungle, away from the bulls and the bears and the headhunters. Even at the centre of the teeming metropolis, it is possible for sunlight to fall. A plant may grow, an egg may split open, a grub may feed on the plant, form a chrysalis, and then, pushing its way out of the shell, its wings hardening rapidly, a butterfly emerges. The sunlight, which started the cycle, dances playfully on the iridescent scales which interlock to form the wings. There is an experimental movement, and the butterfly takes to the air, wings applauding its own amazing feat. The wings move air molecules, set up vibrations, which spread around the globe until days, weeks, even months later, rain clouds gather over a distant country, and a light drizzle begins to fall. Effect follows cause, as inevitably as night follows day. Or does day follow night? Or what if there is only night? Everything is connected. Subtle links exist between everywhere and everywhen. Singularity unifies them. At singularity, everything is one. It is the quiet at the centre of a tornado. the Eye of Harmony. On a planet far away from the tranquil pleasures of Central Park, a planet called Gallifrey, whose history is tied up with the Earth's far more than its inhabitants appreciate, there dwell a people whose upper echelons are self-styled Lords of Time. These Time Lords, when important affairs of state require a display of pomp and ceremony, come together in a place called the Panopticon Hall. It is a place with great significance to them, for beneath it, entwined in bonds forged by the legendary first Time Lord Rassilon, is the black hole which in Gallifreyan folklore has become known as the Eye of Harmony. From this rich source springs forth the raw Artron energy which powers every TARDIS, from the simplest timescape, or at least those which did not rely, God forbid, on the telepathic powers of their occupants, to the more recent and more sophisticated models, which could travel beyond the accepted boundaries of this universe into the eternal nothingness and return. Even a battered Type 40 draws its vitality from this wellspring, if it can. But links are essential, and the Doctor's TARDIS was losing its link. Time and space are linked. They intersect at an angle determined by some alien, non-Euclidean geometry, and the place where they meet is the space-time vortex. Like a poorly enlarged photograph, the vortex is grainy, particulate. Sometimes the particles clump together at a nexus point. The TARDIS hung in the vortex, straining to maintain her position against the streaming delta flows. Like Scylla clinging to her rocky home against the demon pull of Charybdis, the TARDIS embraced a nexus point with tenuous mathematical equations. At any time, the hold could snap, and the TARDIS would be swept uncontrollably along. In her present state of disrepair, this could prove fatal for her occupants. Unaware of her imminent danger, Ace sighed heavily and marvelled at the illusion of openness created in this section of the time machine. It was as though there really was sky stretching away above her. The sound of birdsong drifted along the cloistered walkways and echoed between the pillars. There was the smell that damp earth gave off immediately after a rainstorm, and the air was pure and clean. A twisted sapling cast a shadow across her brown eyes as she lay upon the low stone bench, looking upwards. Under other circumstances, she would have found the TARDIS's cloister room relaxing. But now it just fueled her increasing frustration with its all-invasive tranquility. The Doctor had been at work for some time now, repairing the TARDIS's damaged systems. Every time she had ventured into the control room where the hexagonal console resided, she had found him with his head concealed by a mass of wiring. She had given up trying to talk to him, and had sought other entertainment in the myriad rooms of the TARDIS. Some hadn't been opened for centuries, their contents long resigned to suffocation under a thick layer of dust, and Ace wasn't the type to start spring cleaning. She went on through the rooms until she found a workshop which had been occupied quite recently. She toyed idly with various tools, creating a minor explosion, and left. Now she was seriously bored and wanted to do something. Above her, a bell started tolling. She tried to ignore it, but it went on and on, reverberating back and forth in her skull. When she could stand it no more, she stood and strode along between the ivy-shrouded columns. Looking down at the floor, she saw footprints. This area was sheltered from above, and something had come in from the ersatz ruin and wandered towards the exit. The tiny marks were a cat's paw prints. Ahead of her, Ace caught a glimpse of something moving. Casting a second glance at the floor, she stepped towards the movement and headed for the console room. The tolling of the bell stopped, but it had already been banished from her mind. She found the Doctor slumped in his wicker armchair. Maybe it was just her current preoccupation, or had the barely mumbled word before she entered been links? "What's that?" she asked. She looked closely, examined him. The Time Lord looked drained, almost old. It was as though the trials that the TARDIS had been through were taking their toll on him. He was over 700 years old, and at the moment looked like he was bearing every moment of those years upon his shoulders. This was not to be expected, for the Doctor belonged to a race who had the ability to regenerate their physical bodies when they became too damaged. And besides, he had a stronger constitution than many small countries. "What's up, Doc?" she asked, trying to inject some cheer into her voice. She squatted down in front of him and looked up at his lined face and deep, dark eyes. "Oh, nothing." He ruffled her hair and managed to smile, but the lines in his forehead remained in place. Universal ennui, perhaps. "Professor, I saw the cat again." The cat. When the TARDIS had sustained its present damage, inflicted upon it by a mysterious alien process, it had manifested itself in the disturbed dimensional turmoil as a silver cat. Whilst the TARDIS had hung in limbo, Ace had seen the cat, in brief glimpses, wandering the corridors. It seemed, she thought, to be growing bolder, as if it was moving towards making contact. She wondered how its silver fur would feel, rubbing and rippling against her legs. "I heard the cloister bell ringing," the Doctor told her. Ace stood and went round to the other side of the console. She toyed with a switch. "I've just come from there," she said. "And now you're here." The Doctor nodded, as if confirming something in his own mind, and the cloister bell has stopped ringing. "Where?" he asked suddenly. Ace's distracted fumbling was interrupted. "Where what?" "Where did you see the cat?" the Doctor asked. "In the cloister room." "A call to man the battle stations," the Doctor murmured to himself. "I think the time for action has come, Ace. I've reached an impasse in repairing the TARDIS. There is nothing more I can do." "Why not?" "Spare parts are required." "For what?" The Doctor rose from his chair and looked around confusedly. "Block transfer computation," he told her, as if this made the point clear. He wasn't prepared to tell her of the damage to the link with the Eye of Harmony. Links were important to the Doctor. He had connections, some more fundamental than others. The thought that the energy of the TARDIS might be lost completely worried the Doctor intensely. He could no more reveal his fear than a warlock could reveal his true name. That knowledge could give others a power over him, if they knew how to use it. He couldn't risk anyone having that power. Once before he had done so, never again. He looked under the chair. "Professor, what's block transfer computation?" "The method by which the outer plasmic hull of the TARDIS, the interior configuration, and a host of other details are derived. Have you noticed any signs of the dysfunction? Slight deficiencies in the corridor subroutines, the fractal constructions? Block transfer mathematics, you see, was discovered by the Logopolitans. They were on the verge of a breakthrough, setting up entropy-reducing programs to run on computers, when the Master turned his attention to them. No one else has their mathematical skill, and so TARDISes require morphologically unstable living organic matter for their block transfer function." "Morpho... The Doctor furrowed his brow and ran his fingers through his dark brown hair. "The calculations change reality, and ordinarily computers wouldn't be able to withstand that sort of stress without losing their own ability to function. Organic matter is adaptable, but the TARDISes is somewhat atrophied. So where can we get some more?" "I haven't the faintest idea. Gallifrey, perhaps Axos, even Nestine matter might work." He paused and scratched his head. "Ace, where did I put my hat?" Ace turned and pulled open the semicircular doors of a cupboard set into one of the wall roundels. Something like quicksilver darted past her shoulder and landed lightly on the sloping console. Ace spun round in time to see the mercurial silver cat leap deftly amongst the controls, and then plunge headfirst into the monitor screen, where it left a burning afterimage which remained some time after the rest of it had gone. The central time column began to rise and fall, its interior rotor easing slowly into motion. Suddenly, the floor heaved and Ace was flung against the wall. Vibrations rocked the TARDIS and its dimensions twisted. Its mathematical anchors pulling free of the nexus point, the TARDIS threw an algebraic lifeline into the vortex. It looked wildly and then caught. As the equations hardened into reality, the real-world interface was inserted into a new locale. A light drizzle began to speckle the TARDIS's outer plasmic hull.